Welcome again. And today we're going to continue in our discussion about preaching. This is more about homiletics. And we want to talk about the main idea in the sermon. We've been talking about how we prepare for preaching, and so far we've looked at series planning. We've also looked at the process of studying and a couple different sessions to prepare for a sermon. And I've noted how study comes down to a single point. It's as if you start with all this information and work your way down to a single point at which that's what you're going to talk about in the sermon and expresses what the passage says to you about the issue at hand. So this is the context, this is the time at which we develop the single thought for the sermon. And I want us to look together today more about forming that single statement, what I'm calling the main idea. And to be clear, I'm pulling on a number of different preachers who use this principle in preparing the sermon. I'm especially in debt to Andy Stanley's book, Preaching for a Change, though there are others that have really talked about how you develop this single point for preaching, whether they use the single point specifically in the process of preaching the sermon or use it to develop an outline for preaching. But today we want to talk about developing that single main idea or bottom line, some preachers call it. Now, before we talk about how we develop that main point, we need to think through why. Why would we not just develop an outline, go through the text, some other way of preaching? Not everyone does use this particular approach, but for me, it's really helped my preaching to have a single point to work from and then develop everything around that. So here's the why. I want us to think about that first before we get to the how. So why use a single main idea? Well, let's begin. First of all, people can only retain so much information. Now, I think that this has changed in Western culture. I don't know how much this applies to African culture, but as we use more and more screens and we have less and less longer form media like newspapers, people can retain only so much information. Their attention spans have decreased. Most of the time, we want just a paragraph or two of information about any one topic. We're not willing to read that much. So we preachers have to think about that, how that applies to us as well. People will struggle to remember 3 points in your sermon, or two, or four, but hopefully they can remember one main thing that you're preaching on, especially if it's worded in a way that is memorable. If we can develop a main idea that is important to people, reaches them at their current need, at a place where their lives and scripture intersect, then they may be able to remember the main idea that we give them. Second, a main idea provides unity for the sermon, right? It's easy for us, because of all we study, to bring all this information that we've learned into the sermon. But some of it's really not going to communicate what they need to hear. This provides unity for the sermon. Even though we have lots of great information that we've gotten in this course of studying the passage, we really want to communicate to them something that they will take home. If we bring everything we've learned, we're going to give them a lot of information, but they may not remember any of it. So it's good for us to focus our preaching on one particular thought. Our communication is going to be much better if we have one idea to present to them. So regardless of whether we preach one main point, which is what I tend to do, I tend to come to this main idea, this bottom line, and then what I want to do is drive home that point. I want them to remember that one single point. Now, whether you do that or you then take the main idea to develop an outline of 2 to 4 main points, the whole sermon is going to be more effective if it's organized around a main point. So you don't want to preach one point on faith and 1 point on hope and 1 point on being a good parent. You want one main idea that guides the whole sermon, and that main point, that main idea, is something that people will take home with them. Third, a main point is more likely to lead to life change. I fully believe this. The main idea makes the sermon more likely to lead to life change. If we give them one thing that they're going to live by, then that one thing is going to help them change the way that they live and to live in a more biblical way. So we want to take something that they can do, all right, and then allow that to change the life that they're living. Now, let's think about, okay, how do we do this? What are the characteristics of a good main idea? So what makes a good main idea? If we're looking at a passage and we're trying to come up with the one thing that it says in this context, and remember that scripture is always going to say a lot of different things. And so we have to decide what is the one thing it's saying to me in this setting at this time. It's not that the others are not important, but what does the congregation need to hear now from this passage? And that means a lot of prayer, a lot of thought. What are the characteristics of a good main idea? Let's begin. First of all, it should be biblical. We're biblical preachers, right? We want to preach a biblical sermon. We have focused in on that from the very beginning of this course. And if we want to be biblical preachers, then what we preach needs to come from Scripture. So the number one thing that we need to remember is that our main idea should come from the passage. Now, the truth is we're going to be tempted to go in different ways. Sometimes we may tend to choose a main idea, okay? We decide what we want to preach, and then what do? We go to Scripture to try to pull that out and to prove it. And so we pull from various passages that will prove what we've already decided to preach. If we're not careful, that ends up being what I want to say rather than allowing Scripture to speak to the church. So what we need to do is to allow Scripture to form our main idea. The truth is what we want to pull from Scripture. Remember, we've done all that study. And the reason we've done all that study is to allow Scripture to speak to us and then us to speak to the congregation. So what we need to do is allow that study to lead us to the main idea. So if we're going to be intellectually honest, we may find that we expect the text to say one thing, and through the course of study, it says something entirely different. Well, we can stick to what we've decided we're going to preach, or we can allow the passage to speak to us and then speak to the church. And I think that's a much better way. Scripture sometimes surprises us in what it's going to say, and we have to allow it to surprise us and maybe preach it in such a way that it surprises the congregation. Our study should lead us to biblical truths. We may find that it leads to a number of biblical truths, but we as interpreters need to choose the one main idea that our church, our audience needs to hear. That's why it's great to be the preacher in a local congregation, because we know ourselves and we know the church. And so we can allow Scripture to speak more specifically to the congregation rather than just saying what we want to say. So, it may be that we'll preach on the same text multiple times in our career, maybe even in the same church. I mean, if you're in the same church for the course of 10, 15, or 20 years, you're going to come back to some texts. It may be that you preach through the Gospel of John more than once in that time period. And so we're going to allow that passage to speak, and it may say different things at different times. So we allow it to do that. It might even be that in the process of studying a passage, we come up with 2 or 3 great main ideas. And what we do is we keep a notebook. All right. We find some way to keep track of what we've learned from that passage, and things that we are not preaching today, we can preach later on. So overall, the point is that our study leads us to the main point that we're going to preach from, the main idea, the bottom line. And all of that will inform the process of writing the sermon because we have been steeped in the text. We have allowed the text to form us rather than us forming the text. So a good main idea is, first of all, and most importantly, biblical. Second, it's memorable. If we want our listeners to remember the main point that we're teaching from, then we need to form it and do the hard work of making that main point memorable. And that means we say it in a way that flows, say it in a way that really gets attention. This is time-consuming, hard work, and you may have a whole page of main ideas that are related, but you only preach one of them because the sermon needs that unity. So we want to create a main idea that is short enough to be able to remember, but clear enough to make the point. Now, here's the thing. My guess is if you have a sermon outline of 2 to 4 main points, you're going to need them written down because you're going to make sure that you say them correctly. But what we want to do is create a main idea that is so clear and so concise that we remember it, and therefore the congregation can remember it. This means we're going to be working through several revisions of the main idea along the way. We want to try several versions on for size, maybe even speaking them aloud before we settle on the one that speaks the truth from Scripture. Remember, it's biblical, most clearly. So, just a little quick note on the way that I work through this, and we've talked some about this in the process of study, right? So I read through the text, make my notes, and then develop some ideas for the main idea at the outset. So I've got some ideas, then I go to the commentaries, come back to the main ideas, and sort of reform them, revise them. So the idea is you're going to spend a lot of time thinking through what the main idea is because it is so important. It may be the most important thing you do to come up with that biblical main idea and then craft it in such a way that it's memorable, that people will be able to take that home with them. Third, it needs to be action oriented. We want to give our listeners something to do, not just something to know. We want to give them something to do. Now, there are times when we're preaching through a text and what we learn is more theological than it is actionable. Okay. For example, if we are back to preaching from Colossians chapter 1, 15 through 20, this great Christological passage that we spent a good bit of time talking about, that one may be less action oriented than others because the theology there is so deep and important. We're teaching something about Jesus. But even then, we can talk about faith. We can talk about how Jesus changes how we understand life so that somehow it becomes a little more actionable. Knowing biblical truths is really important, but doing something with them is of equal or greater importance. So, one of the things that we want to do is to show that the Bible is relevant to daily life, that the biblical truths there are action oriented, and so people can know that the Bible speaks to real life. So it should be action oriented. It should also be applicable. Now, this is really similar, right? This is part of what we're talking about. But we're taking it to a different level. The main idea is clear enough that our listeners will know from the outset how to apply it to their lives. So we're going to apply Scripture. Okay, we're going to say this is one way. These are three ways that you can apply this Scripture to your life. But we also want to make it so clear that we don't have to do all that work for the listeners, right? We want to give them something that is actionable that then they take and apply it to their context, because our listeners are not all in the same context, right? They're in different contexts. And so we want to allow them to apply it to family life, maybe if they have young kids or older kids, or they're facing retirement, or they're just about to get married, or they're in school. So we want our teaching to be applicable to many of those situations, and we want to word the main idea in such a way that they can take it and apply it. Okay, let me give you some examples of this. I want you to think through with me how we might form a good main idea. My guess is over the course of preaching a span of a number of years, or maybe if you're preaching in the same congregation for a long time, you'll find that you come up with some really good main ideas, some ones that you're proud of, and you'll remember maybe weeks, months, or even years later. And then there are some that you go, man, that was okay, but it wasn't awesome. That's just the nature of preaching. I preached some sermons over the years that I go, well, that was all right, but I could have done better. I look back on some sermons from many years ago and think, wow, I could do a whole lot better now. That's part of preaching, and that should not discourage you. What it should do is make you feel proud that you know that there's more to be done there. So let's take a look at my series on Colossians. I'm only going to look at 3 of these and think about why I chose the main idea and why that idea I think may be able to communicate well. So let's look at this. Colossians chapter 2, verse 16 through 23. To remind you where we are in the letter at that point, it's a passage in which Paul tells the Colossians not to allow anyone to judge them on the basis of the claims made by those who are adhering to the Colossian heresy. So the people who were the false teachers were condemning the Christians who were not following them, okay? And they're saying that the special Jewish practices, the mystics that they've have given them ideas of what they should do. And they're saying if you don't follow those, then you're not a real Christian. Jesus is not really in touch with you. So Paul is saying Jesus is sufficient, not all these practices. Here was my main point, my main idea. Extra rules don't make you extra spiritual. Now, I believe this was the best main idea that I came up with in the course of this series. All right, extra rules don't make you extra spiritual. Now, I had some good main ideas. We'll talk about a couple that I felt confident about. I had some that were okay. This was the best of them. Extra rules don't make you extra spiritual. Now, I think people hear that and they know what I'm talking about. So if you apply extra rules to your Christianity, it's not going to make you a better Christian. Okay? That's pretty clear right from the outset. But I think the repetition of the word extra here makes it more memorable. Extra rules don't make you extra spiritual. So they can grasp it up front. It's actionable, right? Okay, I'm not going to make extra rules for myself and I'm not going to try to impose them on other people. And it's applicable to lots of different areas of our lives, whether we're talking about developing our spirituality or we're talking about the way we interact with other people. This is one that's easily applicable. And I think it really reflects what Paul was saying in the passage. So it is biblical. Let's turn to a second one. This is from Colossians chapter 3, the first part of the chapter. The sermon that I had here was called Choice. Paul is writing here about the vices that they needed to put to death. So Paul lists the two lists of 5 things that he says, you need to put this to death, you need to get rid of this. And then he's painting a picture of what they should be. Now, Paul is saying, listen, you've been offered a new life, okay? And baptism puts you in touch with that new life. Now, the main idea that I came up with here is don't waste a second chance. Man, that's about as clear as it comes, right? It's a really simple statement. But the point is, God's offered you a second chance. What are you going to do with it, right? What are you going to do with the second chance that God's given you? Don't waste it. And we could bring in lots of ideas about how second chances work in our lives, right? We get second chances, and part of the point is you don't want to waste it. When you've blown it once and someone gives you a second chance, don't waste the second chance. I think that's really memorable. It's very simple. It's biblical, okay? It's actionable, because if you've been given the second chance, you're going to do something with it, and you can apply it to all different parts of your life. So I think that fits the bill on a good main idea. Okay, third one. This is the last one we're going to talk through. Colossians chapter 1. This is the beginning of the book, the first sermon that I preached. It's an early passage where Paul is praying for the Colossian Christians. He's praying that God will produce fruit in them. And he wants them to do something with the life that they've been given, all right? And so what does he say? This is how I worded it. God is far from finished with you. Now, again, I think this is the biblical message, that you can change, that you can be different, that the Christian life is different from the life that everyone else is leading. Paul is calling them away from the culture, away from the life that they used to live, and saying you can live in a new way. This is what it looks like, and you're going to need to change. And God is in the middle of it. God is far from finished with you. He's going to change some things. Now, this one I think is biblical because it's what Paul's saying. I think it's memorable because it uses alliteration. Now, what is alliteration? It's the repetition of a certain sound, a lot of times a consonant, but not always. Far from finished. And alliteration makes it easy to say something. God is far from finished with you, and that makes it memorable. Okay? I think there's application here. People begin to see, hey, God's not done, right? There's stuff that God can do, that God will do in my life, and I need to allow him to do it, and I need to foster that in my life. So this is actionable and applicable as well. So these 3 extra rules don't make you extra spiritual. Don't waste a second chance. God is far from finished with you. These are just examples, okay? This is not the only way to preach that passage. You might, in your setting, come up with a different bottom line. God is far from finished with you. God has work to do in you. God is still at work. It could be any number of things. That's just the way that I came up with it. You will come up with great main ideas in your preaching, but you're going to come up with some that struggle as well, and that's okay. All I can say is do the hard work. Do the work of study first, right? Because you can't come up with a biblical main idea unless you study the Bible. So do the hard work and then do the really hard work of coming up with a main idea that has to be, first of all, biblical. That's your most important thing. But then revising it enough that it becomes memorable and action oriented. This is a big part of preaching. Don't skip this step. All right. Spend the time it takes to come up with the main idea that you need to make it a great sermon.